between local and global. Yesterday I had quite a very interesting presentations, and at each time I was thinking as a geographer that what was said by the contributors was very close to what I'm working on. I'm working on cities and ports in the West African coast. Those cities are all of them old colonial cities. And in fact, if you think about global and local, we must not separate them. Most of the people think first we are working on local and then we are thinking global. In fact, global has no means for the people unless they live global in the local, where they live. And the globalization of the world, what in French we call mondialisation, it's not exactly the same meaning, means that we can't understand global if we don't understand that global lives in local. And the tension which is in the title of this session this morning is how to link better and better in our understanding of the way the world is working, global and local. That will, I'm not quite sure about it, but I think that will be what we are going to hear. For example, you will hear first proposals on the link between what happened in South America and what happened here in Senegal. Tensions between European countries in South Africa, in South America and Africa, tensions between the cultural way of living, tensions between the people who want to maintain what they are and what other people say they must be. There will be a good, I think, presentation on the laptop here in Senegal. Don't remain that in fact, beside all that, there is a question of scale. I haven't heard yesterday the word scale first. I was sleeping, I'm not quite sure about it. But we must understand that the scales must be understood as I say, sleeping scales. There is no difference between the local and the global. It's only a question of what we say in photography or zoom. And you must change all the time of focus. But the real can't be understood without this moving of scales. And another thing, I heard about it yesterday, in the geography of transport, we are speaking about gateways. And a gateway works not only from global to the local, it's working also from the local to the global. And this question of gateways is very important to try to understand what is a colonial city. It's not closed, it's not landlocked territories, but the doors must be open at some times and closed at some times. And this is the way for us, for me as a geographer, to try to understand what are colonial cities and what we call, for me today, cities, port cities. They are the gateway of global into local here in West Africa. Thank you. Quelques mots en français peut-être, je ne sais pas, si c'est utile. Puis-je traduire en français ou... Bien, très rapidement. Mon idée, c'est de dire que pour comprendre les cités coloniales, il faut se poser la question d'une part des échelles et de ce que j'appelle les échelles glissantes. Les échelles glissent, elles ne sont pas fixées comme souvent on le pense. Le local ne vit que par le global, et le global, plus exactement, ne s'exprime que par le local. Et c'est ici et maintenant, hic et nous, que l'on vit le global, ou ce qu'on appelle, nous, la mondialisation. Et puis le deuxième élément dans ce que j'ai dit, c'est qu'il est très important qu'on se pose la question des portes, gateways, des portes d'entrée qui sont aussi des portes de sortie, et c'est par ces portes que se produit l'interaction entre le global et le local. Et les villes coloniales sont le témoignage de ce glissement permanent du local au global par la porte que constitue le rivage, que constitue le port. Voilà. Merci. Now, the first presentation for local to global, the foundation of Natal, Brazil, Dakar, Senegal, and the life of the dispute for the South Atlantic and its bordering territories, 16th to 19th century. Robinson Teixeira, Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte, Brazil. Up to you for 15 minutes, perhaps, as you asked me, 20 minutes, but no more. Thanks.
Yes, okay.
No?
I better use the microphone because I speak low. First of all, I want to thank the organizers and everybody else for being here. It's been a great opportunity to share this moment. Is that right? Yes. With you all. I'm not a historian, I'm an architect, so one more reason to be thankful to be here. So this is my presentation with this title that you already know. I'll try to be as objective as I can, even though maybe I will take some a little bit more than 15 minutes, but I'll try. So, this paper deals with the foundation of two cities, Natal, Brazil, and Dakar, capital Senegal, according to a local and global geographical approach or scale of analysis. So the paper is structured in 3 points, and the presentation also in 3 points. The first one, I'll talk about the foundation of the two cities in a very local sphere. In the second point, I'll try to understand the foundation of these two cities in a global or international context. And the presentation here, the introduction, is very useful, very to my paper, because it's exactly what my colleague said. And the third and last point, the local as an expression of the global, common traits of the initial urban sites. Not only I'll compare the initial, the characteristics of the two sites, but also I'll try to understand them in this global context. I'd like to make some initial considerations. The first one is that it's a comparative approach, comparative study, and I had to develop some methodology for that. The second point is why the two cities. Many people ask me that, why did you choose the two cities? There are several reasons. I won't be able to elaborate here on that. But maybe the main reason is the historical strategic role that the two cities had. I will be talking about this. And the third and last consideration is this. This article is part of a much longer study. I've been working on that for some years now. And the result of this work is a book. I brought it here, a little ad, okay? A book that it was launched last month in Paris. It's in French. The title is Le décolleté de l'Atlantique, Natal Dakar, dans une perspective comparative. So it is exactly the same subject, but here just a small, very modified and shortened part of this book. So for those who are more interested, maybe we want to have it. So the first point, from local, the foundation of Natal and Dakar. As I said, I'll try to be as objective as I can, so I'll just pop up some words, some phrases, to give an idea of this point. So it was a very difficult enterprise, natural environment, the Indians, European enemies. We'll talk about this. The immediate purpose for the foundation of Natal was to expel the French, that they were also very interested in the coastal areas of Brazil, not only of Natal, as we shall see, and also subdue the Indians that lived in that area, and that they were friends with the French and enemies of the Portuguese. In the paper, I mentioned this man, Vicente de Salvador, Frei Vicente de Salvador. He is considered the first historian of Brazil. He wrote a book in 1627, and he tells that how the city was founded. And I have some quotes in the paper, and I won't be able to talk about it here. He mentions, for example, the very important military expedition that came from the south to expel the French and to found the city. There's also a peace agreement between the Portuguese and the Indians. That's very interesting, the peace agreement. But there was a peace agreement between the Portuguese and the Indians prior to the foundation of the city. The city began with this fortress called Wise King's Fortress in 1598, and the city was finally founded in 1599. Another thing that's interesting about this whole story is that they received Christian names. Natal, for those who do not know, Natal means Christmas in Portuguese, because it was founded on December 25. And the Wise King's Fortress also was a Christian name, because it was the construction began on January 6th, the day of the Epiphany, in the Catholic calendar. Very rapid, because I can't talk much. What about Dakar? We cannot understand Dakar without making reference to Saint Louis edifício, which were previous establishment before Dakar. It was also a very different enterprise. In the 19th century, there was a change in the general context, and again, we cannot explore this more, but it was a change between the slave export, let's say, economy, to the agricultural colony. More than one paper presentation here mentioned the story of the colonies in the beginning of the 19th century. But the French did not occupy so far, not yet, the Cape Verde Peninsula. That began by the 1820s, the first attempts to occupy that land. There were some commercial obstacles, and that's why they decided to occupy the peninsula, and then by the middle of the 19th century. Again, this is something that you can see in the paper. The definite occupation takes place in 1857, a military occupation of the peninsula by the French. The place at that time was just a village of huts, lots of the native people who lived in the area. And the urban plan of Dakar is implemented in 1862. Some people consider 1857 as the foundation, the date of Dakar, because it was the moment when the French occupied the peninsula. And of course, Dakar is a very good example of the French imperialist interest in West Africa. It will be the capital of the Afrique Occidentale Française, and it's very not only to the interior, to the hinterland of Africa, but also to South America. Documents of the time mention the interest of the French towards South America too. Well, this is the first point. The second one, to global, the emergence of Natal and Dakar in a larger context. So this is a view of the South Atlantic. Probably most of you did not know where Natal was. Dakar, everybody knows. But that's where Natal is. And you see, just is the closest points between South America and Africa. So this is maybe the main reason why I decided to study the two cities, because they have very important geopolitical and military functions, historically, along the time, not only at the foundation. So this is the location of the two cities. Natal, the key to Brazil, I'll explain this later. It was founded in the so-called mercantilist era. And here, just a reminder of the main points. I'm in a group, talking to a group of historians, so there's no need to to elaborate on that, but I just brought some essential points of the mercantilist area because it's important to understand this context, to understand the foundation of Natal. So I'll just read for you the main, of course it's not complete, you could say much more than that, but just a few points about this period of time. So the European overseas adventure since the 15th century, research and accumulation of goods and raw materials, especially metals, gold, internationalization of relations between Europe, the Americas, and Africa, the so-called triangular trade, political control by absolute monarchies of Europe, exclusive trade relations between metropolis and colony, but even though there was piracy, there was smuggling, but that's official, that's what should happen during this time. No indigenous industry, international trade companies, very important in this period, formation of nation states and commercial empires of a national nature, and emergence of a central dominant nucleus, Western Europe, and a vast economic peripheral pre-capitalist territory, Latin America, Africa, and I should say Asia. I did not put Asia here because it was not my interest. We had a very nice presentation yesterday, and you saw how the Portuguese, for example, also went to that area of the planet. So this is the context for the foundation of Natal, so we can understand the foundation in this general context. So the littoral, the coastal area of Brazil was very much involved in all this mercantilist stuff. So the main actors at this time were the Indians, the Portuguese, and the French, but also the Dutch, the English, these other people, especially in the 17th century, the Dutch, for example. But at the moment of the foundation of Natal, there were three main actors, the Indians, the Portuguese, and the French. So the French were very much interested on the coast of Brazil. And there are some historians like this one, Philippe Bonichon, who studied this period. For example, he says that hundreds of ships from France went to Brazil during this time, the 16th and the 17th century. And so this is a map from another historian, Laurent Vidal, also another French, and he's showing all the fights along the coast, especially between Portuguese and French. So you have like here smuggling, Brazil wood, exotic animals, fur that the French were interested in. You have here two attempts to colonize the country. One was in Rio, the other one in Maranhão. And you see the Portuguese punitive expedition to expel the French. So it was a very complicated moment at that time. And also this relates to the global context. And sometimes conflicts in Europe reflected in this area in the other areas of Africa too. So this is the context. And why the key to Brazil? That was one of the settlers, one of the main settlers of that region. Oh, Natal is here. Again, I forgot to mention. It's Natal. Now the confusion involved in all this context. One of the settlers, the Jesuits, that were there even before Natal was founded, in one of his letters, he says this. Rio Grande, which is the captaincy, not the city, but the city will be founded a bit later. He says that this captaincy was the key to Brazil, since it is the closest land to Portugal. This is a very important statement, fundamental statement, because it shows the importance, as I said, the geopolitical importance of Natal. And along its history, along up to this day, Natal continues to have an important military and geopolitical role just because of its location. Just because of its location. I brought an example. I could give some other examples, but I brought one from the 20th century. During World War II, Natal became a very important, in fact, the biggest American military base outside the United States during the war. Only a few people know that. It was a very important American military base, just like Dakar. They also built military bases in Dakar. And there was a very strong connection between the two cities during World War II. So now Dakar also destined to a great future. This area is also very much disputed between the same actors from the other side of the Atlantic. Portuguese, French, Dutch, English, as we know, as has been said here. The first permanent French settlements on the coast is from the 17th century. Also, this new moment when Dakar emerges is a different one from the one of Natal, which was in the mercantilist era. So what are the main points also of this new moment in which Dakar emerges? You had the Industrial Revolution, which was a new phase in the process of globalization. And you also have the specialized macro regions at the global level. This we could see already in the mercantilist era, but here it's even more, it's intensified. So you have areas of manufacturing and international control, Western Europe, areas of slave export, but that is going to decrease along the 19th century, and areas of agricultural, cattle, and mineral production in the Americas. So this is the general context in which Dakar is founded. You have to understand this in this general context. So Dakar Foundation is a military act, I already mentioned. It was crucial to West Africa territorial conquest by the French from the mid-19th century onwards. In the paper, I mentioned this discussion, this debate, local versus state reasons among the French settlers. Some defended local reasons to found the city of Dakar, and the military especially had a much broader vision for the foundation of Dakar, but I can't elaborate on that here. Dakar was a military city of territorial conquest, but also a port city of great commercial importance in the new phase of globalization. And also, just like in Natal, the authorities, and this is just one example, but you can find several other statements very similar to this one. I just took an example of one authority here, French authority, who said this, that Dakar is destined to a great future. So many authorities at that time saw Dakar as a very important strategic city for French interest in the region. And finally, the local as an expression of the global common traits of the initial urban sites. I propose here a table with two items to discuss. First, the relation between the common traits, common points between the two sites, but also to understand, to explain these two sites, the choice of the two sites in this global general context. Of course, not everything can be explained by the global context, but I try to do some relation between the two. In the paper, I analyzed just the first item, the military and the strategic role, because there was no space, and I won't talk about it here for the second item. So in the first item, the military and strategic role, I proposed 3 points: the choice of the site as the expression of similar and long-range interests, the proximity to the sea, and military equipment. So let's talk about these 3 points here, and with that we are closing. So all I'm going to say here applies to both cities, okay? Apply to both cities. So both of them have a clear military function of territorial conquest. This is the first point, the choice of the site. Both of them had privileged geographical location in the Atlantic Basin, as we saw. Both of them reflected commercial imperialist interests, especially in the case of the French on Dakar initially. In both of them, the choice of the site can be understood in a global perspective in this first point, the choice of the site. Okay? The second point, the proximity to the sea, it seems obvious. We say, well, this is so obvious. Of course, they should be close to the sea. But it's important to mention. The first reason is that direct communication with the respective metropolises, in a time where communication was by navigation, by ship. So this is one reason. But the other reason is that they couldn't enter in the territory, because it was a space, a very hostile space, not only in terms of the environment, but of the native peoples who lived in these two areas. So it's very natural that the cities were founded on the coast. Both of them represent the empire's tentacles into the conquered lands. And if we had time to talk about this, we would see that both cities are at the origin of the foundation of other cities in the internet. We can talk about this here. Both of them were military outposts and commercial way stations, and they were also border or boundary cities, both geographically, because they were between the sea, the Atlantic Ocean, and the territory in the land, and also symbolically. This is symbolical. This is very important because they represented the limit between the civilized world and the world of barbarians. That's how the Europeans saw, both in South America and in Africa, the native peoples as barbarians. So this is a very symbolically very important. And finally, the military equipment. This is very important in conquest cities. Both of them were conquest cities. This is the case of Natal. You see the fortress I mentioned, the fortress. It's still there, it's still standing, and the city is in the back. So a long time, other equipment, military equipment was introduced to the city, but this is a major one, very important, at the foundation of the city. So it's not natural. The city that was founded to conquer should have military equipment. The same thing to Dakar. This is a map designed by French military. The French military, as you can see in the peninsula, Dakar did not even exist. But this is a map showing the many a project of several military equipment along the peninsula. So even before the city was founded, the French were already thinking of installing, setting up military equipment in the peninsula. This is the fortress Fornestre in Goe Island. It was part of the defense of the peninsula. So this fortress was built just a few years before the foundation of Dakar. So it was very much related to this context of military protection of the city. And to finally, I hope I didn't invest too much. Final considerations, I will bring just three. The first one is that the emergence of both cities is marked by very difficult challenges at the local scale, natural obstacles, native opposition, European rivalry, insufficient number of settlers, etc. Two, at the global scale, they both reflect intense territorial dispute among European nations, roughly the same nations on both sides of the Atlantic coast. This is very interesting. And finally, some characteristics of their initial urban site reflect to a great extent the international or global context in which both cities emerged and can partially explain them. So these are the main points that I could bring up to you this morning. This is the biography, and thank you.
I haven't actually timed this, but I will do my best to keep it in a framework. Good morning, bonjour tout le monde. Je remercie d'abord aux organisateurs pour l'invitation de venir ici. Je suis super content d'être à Saint-Louis. Et comme je fais mon intervention en anglais, je remercie aussi aux traducteurs. So I'm going to introduce the main idea here, and then pull out some of the major themes that I cover in the paper. And then I also have some sources to share with you to give you a sense of what I'm working with. So here goes. So my paper focuses on textile commerce and consumption between Saint Louis, Senegal, and Freetown, Sierra Leone. I'm sorry, between Saint Louis and the Soninke-controlled markets of Gajaga in the late 18th century. And this is a period, of course, an Islamic reform movement which emerged at Fouta Toro to challenge commercial relationships along the length of the Senegal River. The paper I submitted comes from a book I'm completing that offers a history of the broad region between Saint Louis, Senegal, and Freetown, focused on textiles and dress, in which I argue that in Western Africa, buyers' choices responded to local, cultural, political, and environmental conditions that broadly impacted global commercial networks. They also offer perspectives on how people negotiated individual or group status in pluralistic African societies experiencing revolutionary change, while also becoming linked to overseas markets in new ways. So to just give you a brief sense of the chapters in the book, I really open in the book with, and how this particular paper fits into the overall project. I open the book with a sort of exploration of the use of the term pièce d'Inde as an accounting term used by European traders to refer to enslaved captives. And of course that term evokes the connection of this trade to India. And in the next chapter, I consider the place of weaving and textiles in the oral traditions of Karta, which of course is a major Bamana-speaking polity to the east of the Senegal River. And in those oral traditions, there's a discussion of the sort of founder, who was a weaver, Sansana, and his relations with Soninke hosts in his context. And then I move on to a discussion of Saint Louis. And then the sort of final two chapters look south to coastal Guinea and the Rio Pongo in the early 19th century is one chapter, and then finally I close still in the Rio Pongo area during the shift towards an economy based on groundnut cultivation from the 1830s, the expansion of Christian missionary presence there, and also of liberated Africans from Sierra Leone and returnees from Barbados. So that's the general overview and where this particular work fits in. So in terms of themes and questions, one of the bigger underlying questions that drew me both to this larger study and that I'm grappling with in this paper as well is, what are the consequences of understanding the 18th century history of Western Africa primarily through the lens of slavery and enslavement? As a number of historians have been pointing out recently, textiles were the primary good imported by Africans into this region as an extension of commerce that was global in scale. So what happens when we shift our focus to this commodity rather than the more familiar questions around enslavement? Which actors become more visible? What implications flow from focusing on this particular commodity? This is, of course, not to deny the importance of slaving, about which there's a very large literature, as we all know. But thinking about this other major interface between Africans and the rest of the world helps to bring forward historical actors often lost in narratives of this period, such as indigo dyers, who were women, enslaved workers, such as Lapto and Pibas, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. And also helps, it also can serve as a means to grapple with the great variety of ethnic groups and polities that are in play in this space. So in terms of our discussion about the relationship between colonial cities and their connected hinterlands that we've been having here thus far, one reality that surfaces when this discussion turns to textiles is that the hinterland is effectively importing a great deal from the colonial town for its own purposes. And that may or may not be leading to increased urbanization. But in any case, these imports are feeding local economies along the length of the river, and in particular reaching the large markets of the Gajaga region. And then even within the context of this dominant commerce around both slaving and textiles, there was much complexity in terms of the motivation of different actors. And so when we think about people as distinct and different as the Damel of Kayor, the Almami Kadakan of Futa Toro, or of enslaved girls in households here in Saint Louis, how do we now subsume all of them under the umbrella of a singular African response to Atlantic trade? Can we first disentangle these various and competing agendas before thinking about how they interact over time to produce a particular outcome or set of outcomes? And how can we not lose sight of the fact that even among the enslaved, they attempted to shape their own reality within their constraints. Okay, so and all this is in much extended detail in the paper, but what are some of the major themes I'm dealing with? The first theme really concerns emphasizing the role of Africans as active agents in shaping their engagement with Atlantic and global exchange rather than populations that are acted upon. I think this also helps to integrate the ongoing importance of the trans-Saharan exchanges into a story primarily understood as Atlantic. I have a discussion later in the paper about the revolution in Fututoro, which becomes relevant in that context. The Almami Kader Khan became famous in abolitionist circles in Europe for effectively blocking slave trading along the river, abolishing slavery within his domains, and initiating projects to build mosques. And that was quite likely accompanied by the expansion of cloth production, which was a skill that was often taught in this kind of context of Quranic schools. What I argue when this comes up in the paper is that Kader Khan's conflict with the French was not a complete rejection of all commerce with Europeans, but rather an attempt to contain and to regulate this trade, these exchanges, by harnessing it to his project of Islamic reform. And in that context, the ongoing linkages with the Sahara remain relevant. The second important theme for me here is an emphasis on the heterogeneity of populations living here in Saint Louis and the practice of cultural pluralism. The populations here at that time were diverse in language, religion, and ethnicity, and the town had grown over the course of the 18th century because of its trading activity. In terms of cultural pluralism, I argue that its expression here in Saint Louis was importantly informed by a longer West African history of similar practices, mediating interaction between different groups, between different ethnic groups, and thus cannot fully be understood as a novel or exceptional phenomena produced only on this island. On the other hand, there were unique factors here, such as the interaction between self-identified Catholics and Muslims, represented partially by the way observers describe Sinjar as attending church, but also, quote, doing the salam. And of course, the way they combined different forms of clothing, which is often described and commented upon. I would argue that this particular form of hybridity makes Saint Louis unique, if not in coastal Africa, where we might find other examples, but certainly in the broader Atlantic world at this period. This particular combination between Catholics and Muslims. I try to get at this in the paper in a longer discussion about Lapto sailors. Some of whom, and really sort of talk about the differences in their ethnic backgrounds and religious backgrounds. So some of them were identified as Christians, some as Muslims. Some had been trafficked to the coast as captives, and later rose in status over the course of their lives. Some at the same time are actually the sons of elite Soninke, based in the interior, who had sent them here specifically to live in the French fort, to learn business and to facilitate specifically these ties between Saint Louis and the interior. The third major theme in this paper is around questions of fashion and dress, of course, and for me, this is about, as a couple of people have mentioned already in our conference, keeping the focus on people. As a counter to the tendency to write in terms of broad processes, abstractions, and structures, which tend to erase the specificities of human behavior. In my view, as a historian, people are always the best parts, always the most interesting, do things that are sometimes unexpected that can tell us much about the human experience over time. And this fact should never be lost in historical interpretation. So in the context of working, in the context of limitations, right, and the silences of the archival material available to us, dress is a way to capture at least some of that individuality and difference and distinction. And so this approach that I'm taking here follows the developing literature in the historical study of fashion, and attempting to extend that beyond its focus on elite metropolitan fashions. Okay, so what are the implications of this approach? One of the things that this argument is about Saint Louis is doing is to expand what it means to be urban and cosmopolitan precisely during the time in which these phenomena have been thought to be particularities of metropolitan European capitals. In the paper I cite Simon Ducandi's recent work in which he argues that Parisian cosmopolitanism was supposed to be measured precisely in its contrast to the vulgarity of so-called slaving ports. And yet basically one of my main points is that here in Saint Louis, a slaving port, I think one finds considerable evidence of cultural and social sophistication that puts us in a frame that we can speak comparatively. And then this observation extends my larger project's goal, really of integrating history in Africa into sort of conversations about the larger historical transformations. Okay, so sources. I'd like to just briefly share with you some of the sources that I'm working with to get a sense of the challenges and the possibilities they present. And again, I sort of open the paper with a discussion of Lapteau, and the sort of opening discussion comes from this couple of documents I'm about to talk about. The first of which is a sort of shipping agreement for a transatlantic voyage aboard a British ship called the Swallow in 1776, which was designed to travel between Saint Louis, Barbados, Mississippi, and then back to Saint Louis. So I'm just sort of pointing out here at the top that sort of itinerary sketched out there. And then aboard that ship were 5 Lapteau men here listed. And then the thing that this was very surprising and interesting for me to discover, this was in an archive in the United States in Rhode Island. Because the ship ultimately is intercepted by an American group, and the people are captured and taken to Rhode Island. And this is sort of one of the earlier incidents of the American War of Independence. And just looking at the names, it immediately sort of leaps out to me that very likely, that sort of mixture of backgrounds here. And certainly, the name Jack Bambara leaps out in that context, right? So this is a name that is kind of invented. It's not the name his mother would have given him, right? But a name that specifically speaks to here and suggests that this is someone that was not originally from Saint Louis, but that came here. And so there's lots of examples of Bambara-speaking people who were resident here. And so part of this experience of this capture of these people, along with that, was a collection of letters that refer to another group of Lapteau sailors. And so there's a whole set of other names I haven't actually quite figured out. Perhaps they were transporting letters on behalf of others. But these letters, I think, give a very interesting window into Saint Louis society at the time. This sort of idea of literacy, both among the sailors, potentially, and recipients here, sort of intimacy, right? That's not what we really think of. We think about this kind of this type of trade. And so just very briefly, there's 4 letters. They all appear to be written by the same hand, so perhaps written by a letter writer designated. And you can also see the difficulty, right, of trying to interpret this, right, because the language is a bit unclear. So, to Madame Diana Biramé, mes compliments à Touba Dion Voilà, je me porte bien grâce à Dieu, et dites à Birama Jacques de servir la tapade, et dites à notre, I'll just read it, but dites à notre maître toute la tapade, je me paierai le temps que vente au Sénégal, c'est bien mes compliments à ma fille Marie Touba, à Moussa, peut-être Lady Touba, et dites-le de garder bien Massa et Atiba de prendre elle-même, etc. I'm your humble servant. Madoum Wallo promis de me donner des choses à choses. Je lui ai dit de le mettre dans la tête de mon lit. So very, very specific and just fascinating. So what do these letters tell us about cloth and dress? Difficult. I do know from other people's work that sailors on these oceanic voyages were often given the same uniforms that the British sailors were wearing. Don't know exactly in this case. They could have been wearing a number of things. But really what I've been using them for in this paper is as a reflection on the mobility of these workers that extended to parts of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans at this time, and also importantly into the Sahelian interior, which was often the focus of European traders to reach the large markets in the interior. And so there were also women, certainly on the river routes, right, between Sambui and Gajaga, who worked as cooks and sort of did cleaning labor. And both the men and the women, even as enslaved dependents, or particularly as such, they were, I'm arguing, were agents of change, right? Because they were petty traders who were actually distributing the things that they had access to as a result of this activity. They satisfied particular consumer demands, such as for the famous indigo dyed Guinea, and also helped to create new consumer demands. Okay, so just very quickly to sort of move forward and to get to a conclusion. Thank you. I have several images that appear in the paper, and just to sort of just briefly, and these may be very familiar to some of you and not so to others, but to sort of look at this series of representations from this period of Signor and Marabout, and how the Signor and Marabout are sort of featured at the center, right, of these images, which suggest their location in this larger society. They sort of extensively draped in cloth, and sort of the value of that, and the ability to sort of purchase that. And then sort of as you move from the center to the margins of the pictures, with the servant on the left, the soldier to the right, this is less amount of clothing, which is one thing to note. And then also with the middle image, you sort of see the interaction of the Signor potentially with the Marabout. So we're really talking about a very sort of cultural interaction of different types. This other image I used to sort of help to get at the differences. It's not from Saint Louis, but it's what we have. From Gorée, just to get at the difference of what some of the Lapto may have been wearing, and they're specifically sorted out by sort of religious identification, social status, etc. And so you have sort of a sort of mixed race individual on the left, and sort of reading this the way seems to have been organized. Sort of get a hierarchy, we're sort of beginning here left to right, and then the lowest status would be on the lower right. The mulatto at the upper left, a Noir free black person captive Christian, captive Muslim. And then this is from a series that, again, many of you may be familiar with, but a costume, well, it's called the Encyclopédie de Voyage, produced by Grasset de Saint-Sauveur as part of a sort of much larger effort to catalog clothing around the world. But the sections on Africa and some of these volumes, most of them are focused on Senegal for perhaps obvious reasons, and so it really gives you a sense of a variety, right, of styles that would have been present. And one of the other interesting things about his work is that he comments on the desire for young people here to have particular fashions, right, and so and that they're changing all the time. He also refers to local styles of decorating, sort of adding decoration to cloth, right, to sort of be fashionable. And so all but the sort of second from the left are specifically sort of designated as Senegal, and you get a sense of a mixture of styles. And it's also interesting to think about that, especially here on the second from the right, the sense that what she's wearing may actually be imported, because a lot of the sort of printed cloth may look like that. And then finally, again, to sort of return to the Marabout and the sort of emphasis on covering, extensive covering. And this is an image. Many of the European travelers to the region were guided specifically by Muslims. And so this is from the Molière account. So, to conclude, the global trade in textiles, which underwent a major transformation in the late 18th century, shows the linkages between Atlantic and Indian Ocean commerce. In this paper, I show that some of those linkages were formed by African states, consumers, and laborers themselves, such as Lapto and Pileuse, on river convoys through their work as petty traders, and draw attention to the fact that they, along the way, are seizing on opportunities to advance their own interests. The diverse residents of Saint Louis were cosmopolitan in their embrace of overseas and regional influences, but in ways that may have confounded the ideological expectations of both their contemporaries in Paris and in places like Fouta-Toro. Habitants here in Saint Louis protected their access to foreign sources of goods by allying with European trading partners, yet this did not foreclose the possibility of similar alliances with Muslim or other Africans, which they also cultivated. This polyglot African society here on Saint Louis developed a particular taste for goods such as dyed, indigo-dyed cottons, check patterns, British woolens, French copies of Indian cloth called Antienne, coral glass beads, Maria Theresa silver dollars, which were used to make jewelry, brass buttons produced in Birmingham. And all of this became incorporated into forms of local dress and bodily adornment. The seeming cultural fluidity of Seigneur and other habitants, which is evident in clothing styles and social practices frequently remarked upon, was not a failed attempt at imitating European norms, but an embodied material expression of the island's social landscape. It extended a wider pattern of cultural pluralism practiced in communities throughout the region. Dress mediated the countervailing forces of an expanding colonial power from the coast and the expanding influence of Islam from the interior, a process which was informed by a longer tradition of tolerance for cultural pluralism. It is an embodied history of social and economic relations, which reveals multiple pre-modern forms of cosmopolitanism in West Africa that was precisely linked to the global circulation of people, goods, and ideas. So, thank you. Look forward to it.
After this presentation, we shall go a bit further south in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. But I think there is something common between the two presentations. one we have heard, and the next one is that globalization is not new, it's very old. Saint-Louis, as you know, was already a very good example of a previous globalization. And I think it will be the same with Buenos Aires, as you are going to tell us. So José Emilio Moncua from University of San Martin, Argentina, will speak now about Buenos Aires in the early 19th century, and especially how it moved on with great transformations at that time. So 15 or 20 minutes, just as you like. Thank you
very much. Je voulais d'abord remercier. Do you hear me? Yes? More or less. So, je voudrais d'abord remercier Laura, bien sûr, et puis le Global History Network pour cette invitation qui m'a permis de partager ces journées d'échanges intenses sur le plan intellectuel, scientifique et même spirituel avec ce groupe de savants vieux et modernes. Bon, merci. Et je vais lire un résumé de mon paper en anglais, parce que j'écris le texte en français. Quand j'ai reçu la nouvelle qu'il me fallait seulement 15 minutes, utiliser seulement 15 minutes, je me suis dit, bon, je ferai le résumé en anglais. But even if my English is really awkward, but it's just a little bit less awkward than my French. So I start. Between 1810 and 1820, during the first years of independent rule, Buenos Aires has abandoned its former and outlying position in the Spanish Empire to become not of Atlantic trade, a sample of social reformation, and an unexpected place of ideological exchanges. As a matter of fact, these new things had started in the decade of 1780-90, when the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata began to be a consolidated institution, able to encourage the formation of a new colonial society under the standard of Enlightenment reform. The viceroyalty has been created in 1776. Here we have the map of the viceroyalty. At the final stage of Spanish dominion over South America was the last viceroyalty created by the Spaniards. The main forces for this decision of the crown were military. The court in Madrid has been alarmed by the publication of a book in 1774 written by the English Jesuit Thomas Gordon, where the author mentioned the possibility of a successful invasion of the Spanish colonies at the far south of the Americas through the natural harbors and the river valleys of Patagonia. The pressure of the Portuguese colonies from Brazil on the northern shore of the Rio de la Plata added a major threat against the Spaniards settled in Buenos Aires. But the setting up of a viceroy brought to, and this was really more important, changes into the organization of trade and cultural institutions. The regulation for free trade, signed by the king in 1778, allowed the importation of through Buenos Aires of all kinds of industrial goods produced in Europe but sent only from Spanish ports or afterward. These economic reforms brought Buenos Aires closer to the other two open cities for overseas trade situated by the Atlantic coastline, Cartagena in New Granada and Veracruz in Mexico. Both were fortified cities since the 17th century to ensure the populations in case of pirates' attacks. There you have a view of Cartagena. Cartagena today and a map of Cartagena done in 18th century. Buenos Aires never had, well, here you have the case of Veracruz, the big fortress, and Barrio City. Buenos Aires never had real fortresses, although the regional plan of Buenos Aires founded in 1580. But Buenos Aires never had real fortresses, although the residents of the viceroy, here you have a photo of the 60s in the 19th century. This was the residence, the old residence of the viceroy, and after that the residence of the governor of Buenos Aires and the president of the republic since 1860. But this residence was pompously called the fort. It was the only thing, military thing there. Neither great military buildings, but no ecclesiastical palaces were erected in the town of Verona. For instance, there wasn't any house of the Inquisition in Buenos Aires, differently from Cartagena and Veracruz, where were big palaces for the Inquisition. But the town had an independent theater since 1783, a trade consulate since 1794, and a newspaper, the Telegrafo Mercantil, since 1801. Anyway, Buenos Aires presented a family resemblance to Cartagena and Veracruz. The crowds of African people reduced it to a slavery that never stopped to increase in the town since the signature of the Asiento Treaty in 1713 between Spain and Great Britain after the long war of the Spanish Succession. The treaty enabled the British traders and slave dealers to import huge amounts of African captives into South America through the port of Buenos Aires. Many of them were sent to the mines in Potosí and other places of the Upper Peru, or to the plantations held by the Jesuits in Córdoba, in the center of the country, in order to produce cereals and provide them to the indigenous people of the missions in Paraguay. But a big portion of the slaves remained in Buenos Aires as domestic servants and workers in small farms around the city. Some numbers, I think, could give you a good idea about the demographic importance of African population in Buenos Aires at the crossing of the line between 18th and 19th centuries. So you have a third of the population was of African origin. Before the Asiento, it was never higher than 12%. So this gives an idea of this huge social change caused by the presence of slaves in Buenos Aires, of African population enslaved in Buenos Aires. But according to several sources, reports, memoirs, letters, written by civil servants of the ground or foreign travelers as traders, explorers, and scientists, like Felix de Azara described, the treatment given to slaves in Buenos Aires wasn't so hard or cruel as it was in other regions of the American Spanish Union. That was a trait always underlined by Trump. You will find in the paper a long quotation by Azara, scientist and military, where he cherished the economic and social situation of slaves when compared to the conditions of life among poor, free, and white people in the colony. This is a major book written by Felix de Azara. But I think it's a fundamental element that allows us to to reach a provisional explanation about the social changes occurring in Buenos Aires at the end of the 18th century. Because thousands of male and young people from African origin were incorporated as soldiers to the American armies during the War of Independence against the Spaniards. The phenomenon was not known in the late 18th century, and even before, related to the libertos incorporation. Libertos were the emancipated slaves. The libertos incorporation to regiments of the so-called pardos y morenos. Pardos is half European, half African, and morenos is half African. In times of Spanish rule. It was especially the case of military units dedicated to the control of the borders between colonial territories and lands dominated by native people, so-called Indians, of the Pampas and the Great Chaco. But the involvement of slaves and libertos among the troops that fought in the major campaigns of the Independence War, undertaken by armies organized in the Rio de la Plata, was perhaps the strongest element which assured the final success of the patriot cause in Argentina, Chile, and Peru around 1825. There's a lot of testimonies about that. But here I quote only the testimony of the first British consul in Buenos Aires in 1822. And I think it's very convincing about the matter. He said, "I have already heard young people from Buenos Aires saying that without the intervention of the so-called regiments of libertos, it would be very much difficult to put an end to the war against the Spaniards in the northern provinces of the country." So, but the necessity for providing a legal frame as a warrant of the promises of full freedom made to African people who participated with blood and lives in the battles against the Spaniards, pushed assemblies and other representative institutions settled by the revolutionary governments in Buenos Aires to pass a set of laws to the benefit of the ancient slaves, like the Act for Freedom of Worms, sanctioned in February 1813. This early liberalism was rather exceptional in other countries of South America, except in Chile, where slavery was definitively abolished in 1822. But I think that the explanation could lean upon the existence of a new and a strong bourgeoisie among the inhabitants of Buenos Aires. This young new social class had appeared at the end of the 18th century, advocated by the organization of an efficient bureaucracy for the viceroyalty. It grew and consolidated its economic powers thanks to the expansion of trade at the turning point of the century. And the revolt against Spain brought it to political power. The absence of any aristocratic element in the Rio de la Plata society was really the Villa society, allowed its hegemony in politics, in law fields, and in culture. In my paper, I have tried to show other signs and traces of the emergence of this commercial and bureaucratic bourgeoisie. For example, the steps undertaken by young people in legal proceedings which could support their wills for freedom of marriage. The so-called judgments of dissentment, juicios de disenso, studied by Susan Soto in wonderful books on the subject. But what is important to underline is that these conflicts affected especially couples in which a boy or a girl were seen as descendants of the African population. This juicios de disenso it can be a good sign of this possibility for this libertos or libertas to fight for the recognition of the rights. The second trait that I underlined was the fruitful circulation of the book. Was really John in the profile of the paper. The fruitful circulation of this strange book, The Second Coming of the Messiah in Glory and Majesty, written by a former Chilean Jesuit, Manuel de la Cunza, in the last decade of the 18th century, and published in 1816 in London with the financial support of this guy here, Manuel Belgrano, who was one of the leaders of the independence movement in Buenos Aires. Well, in that text, the Jesuit Lacunza dealt with the apocalyptic subject of the parousia, that is, the coming of Jesus to the earth for the last judgment. He drew it nearer to the petitions for political freedom in the Spanish dominions of the Americas. I'll translate a passage of the book. When the Lord will be glorified with the destruction and ruin of all the wicked, people will claim and sigh for him, with a desire and obsession of knowing and adoring him. Even those who will be at the uttermost parts of the earth, separated from this continent, Europe, because Lacunza was writing in Europe as an exiled Jesuit, so separated from this continent by the most vast oceans. But why Belgrano decided to pay a very expensive edition of that work made by the Wood Printing House in London? Belgrano had been sent to London in order to negotiate in Europe a peace with Spain, where through the coronation of the Spanish infant Francisco de Paula, the brother of King Ferdinand VII. Remember that the European powers had set out the political principle of legitimacy as the main foundation of restored monarchy after the fall of Napoleon, the Papal Circle. What a better candidate then for the government of an old Spanish colony as the Rio de la Plata than a brother of the legitimate king. But the plan failed, and Fernando said to his ambassador in London, he never accepted the possibility of the coronation of Francisco de Paula in Buenos Aires. So Belgrano had to change his style, having always in mind the famous principle. He made the following proposal. The legitimate monarch, as for United Provinces of Rio de la Plata, was a member of the old family descended from the Inca Atahualpa, the family that still lived in Cusco. But the Congress of the newborn nation never accepted to discuss the Belgrano project. But as a conclusion, from 1780 to 1820, the panorama of Buenos Aires as a colonial city has radically changed. At the beginning of that period, it seemed that it could evolve as other Atlantic ports of the Spanish Empire, Cartagena or Veracruz, with similar features regarding slavery and military purposes of inferior ports. After 4 decades, the dominating role of the new bourgeoisie, born in the capital of the Viceroyalty, had transformed the view. Buenos Aires became a field of social and cultural experimentation for the local expression of this new social class, the bourgeoisie, which was ruling all of the Atlantic world and taking political and economic power in Europe as well as in the Americas. Thank you.
Now it's time to Nancy Gavin from Britain to help us by his personal understanding of what we have heard. So we have time now to help us.
Merci Benjamin. Et merci à tout le monde. Je suis une autre intruse, je ne suis pas historienne, je suis politologue, mais je vais me débrouiller à chercher des thèmes communs entre les trois présentations, interventions. On the question of language. Chisumahol, Bugna Waklan Chilaku Ndar. Wante Amuma Hamhambi, Amuma Laku Kochibarma. Kondina Jahasuk, Ailaku Tuba, anglais et français. Je voudrais bien parler en Wolof, de toute la présentation en Wolof. Mais pour moi, c'est impossible, parce que je n'ai pas la connaissance du connu philosophe Wolof Kochibarma. Donc, je vais mélanger un peu l'anglais et le français. It is a great pleasure to engage these three stimulating papers. Ce sont des interventions excellentes. Tous les trois sont des instances d'enchevêtrement entre le local et le global. Et j'emprunte intentionnellement un mot clé de l'intervention de Jody Benjamin, enchevêtrement, qui est vraiment important dans son étude et bien aussi dans tout le panel. These three papers are dealing with the entanglement of the local and the global in interesting ways. Of course, in the founding and in the emergence of key colonial port cities spanning the South Atlantic. So I really feel like in reading these papers, I am inspired by Benjamin Streck's approbation that we should think in terms of scale. And it's very much the case that these three papers are operating in interesting ways in terms of interplay, enjeu, entre plusieurs échelles locales et globales. Given where we are in the history of the South Atlantic in these papers, given the history of imperialism, given geography, given the ferment of new ideas and social relations in roughly the 16th and 19th centuries, in each of these authors' hands, the colonial port city becomes a site to observe at least three intertwined themes of local global enjeux d'échelle. Donc, voyant l'histoire, voyant la géographie et l'évolution des idées, et surtout l'évolution du libéralisme et de l'impérialisme pendant la période du 17e au 19e siècle, c'est le port colonial qui devient le site pour voir des trois thèmes, des enjeux échelle, des enjeux locaux globaux. Premièrement, la mise en scène de l'implantation géostratégique d'une ville coloniale. Donc, the first thing that we see in all these papers is a kind of scene setting for the implantation of a geostrategically important post, if you will. Deuxièmement, ce sont les effets d'entraînement ou l'interaction entre des formes des ondes résultant de cette intervention et les réponses à cette intervention. Donc, je veux dire que, en anglais, we're seeing a kind of ripple effect in the locality resulting from first the implantation of the new presence, and then what gets very interesting is the interplay of waveforms. So imagine we drop a rock in the water, we have a ripple effect out. Buenos Aires is this rock, Natal, Dakar, San Luis. But there are other waves already in play, coming, for example, from Islamic reform movements, coming from the influence of the rest of imperial Latin America. And so the setting in each of these papers involves overlapping waveforms, which produce very complex effects. Each of the papers, in some level, in the second level, is trying to identify these overlapping waveforms. Et troisièmement, il y a une dimension de l'expérience subjective. Comment il se sent de vivre dans un tel état, dans les tendons dans les réseaux de l'enchevêtrement. Qu'est-ce que c'est l'expérience subjective des acteurs eux-mêmes? C'est très clair dans l'intervention de Benjamin, et c'est évident aussi dans les deux autres papiers. So for me, the most exciting part of these papers is when we go to the lowest level, where we're able to see what it feels like to live in the midst of these overlapping waves. Et quelles sont les opérations quotidiennes de vivre et de naviguer et de survivre et s'avancer dans un tel contexte. How people negotiate the context and how people make the waveforms work for them. How they tune to those waveforms and how they maximize their power in that context. So what I want to do is simply go through each of these 3 points, la mise en scène géostratégique, l'interaction des formes d'onde et l'expérience subjective dans un tel contexte, avec exemple de tous les 3 papiers. Premièrement, pour la mise en scène géostratégique des villes, dans les mains de Teixeira, on voit que Natal et Dakar, bien séparés historiquement, sont en même temps, il y a une motivation du pouvoir colonial pour implanter quelque chose dans ce que Teixeira s'appelle the high points, les points maximaux dans les topographiques, je veux dire, pour confronter des rivaux coloniaux et pour sécuriser des liens de relations économiques, d'échange dans le système mercantiliste. Donc, dans les mains de Teixeira, on voit l'impact de presque tous les 5 pouvoirs coloniaux, espagnol, portugais, hollandais, français et anglais. En même temps, in English, what Teixeira gives us in the beginning, just thinking about the geostrategic implantation, yes, Natal and Dakar are very well separated in time. It makes the cases somewhat problematic to compare. But nevertheless, we can see some, as he points out, there's a very similar imperative for topographical high ground for military purposes. There's a very similar story about locating new posts, new fortifications in places where you can have an influence on the mercantilist flow of trade. And there's a very similar enjeu with regard to the various colonial players, European colonial players at the time. In the case of Jody Benjamin, we have, just in terms of Saint Louis, one of your many cases, so just extracting Saint Louis from your book, it's important to note that it's 600 kilometers upriver to Gajaga. And there's a lot going on between Saint Louis and Gajaga. To me, that's in the paper, that's very much the heart of the story, is seeing how the relations for slaves and for, with regard to textiles and other goods going back and forth up the river really sets the scene for the rivalry among European powers. But in the case of the Senegal River Valley, very importantly, the engagement with Islamic reformist movement, Qadir Khan, the Torobe revolution of the late 18th century. At the same time, both actors, European and Islamic, are working in relation to trying to figure out where they stand with regard to the indigenous kingdoms, particularly Kajor, the big Wolof kingdom right here in this region. So that's the scene setting there. C'est-à-dire pour Benjamin, c'est une mise en scène où il y a des relations économiques qui traversent tout le fleuve Sénégal entre Saint-Louis et Gajaga, avec des échanges de plusieurs biens et personnes, bien vrai. Et c'est une relation où les pouvoirs européens doivent se concourir avec des mouvements de réforme islamique, surtout dans les mains de Qadir Khan et la révolution Torobe fin du XVIIIe siècle, et aussi les relations avec les royaumes indigènes comme le Cairo. In Buenos Aires, for Burusura, the scene setting has to do with, of course, the central theme really, to me, is the emergence of Buenos Aires' late arrival in the movement for independence from Spain, and the fact that Buenos Aires is kind of different kind of colony. It's less burdened with the legacies of imperial rule of Veracruz and Cartagena. It's a place where a new bourgeois spirit can arise, which becomes very important in your story. And of course, it's positioned in relation to this emerging British threat from the possibility of a British colony in Patagonia. Okay, so that's point one. All three of them set the scene in terms of geostrategic implantation, as I mentioned. Second point, the ripple effects, so les effets d'entraînement triggered by implantation. In the study of Natal and Dakar by Teixeira, what we see is the implantation of Natal, of course, triggers some responses on the part of indigenous groups, and very fascinatingly, this, which you didn't mention in the presentation, the rivalry among captaincies. So that the strategy for handling the very large Brazilian territory is to divide it up among various kind of captains who have a hereditary control over a certain quasi-feudal domain, and they're jockeying against each other. So as soon as we're starting to talk in 1599 about putting Natal in place as a geostrategic implantation, a bunch of actors are beginning to respond in new ways, which changes the context of how Natal is born. So the interacting waveforms in Teixeira's hands show this important role played by the indigenous people, rival captains, and of course other European powers. Donc dans le contexte du Brésil, il y a une rivalité entre des capitaines qui avaient le droit de s'occuper certains terroirs dans le Brésil, et aussi, en même temps, eux, ils étaient en train de chercher davantage entre eux, en même temps qu'il y a des conflits avec des indigènes et avec des autres pouvoirs européens. In Buenos Aires, the really, to me, very fascinating piece of the story is emancipation. That the story of late 18th, early 19th century Buenos Aires is a gradual process of creating more emancipated people, the libertos, who in North American terms are like indentured servants. They have a period of contracted slavery after which they achieve a level of greater freedom. And so Buenos Aires in the early 19th century is part of a much wider context of liberalization, and it's playing it out with regard to people of African descent in fascinating ways, linking these people to a military role and linking these people to struggle for independence, which, as you know, would not be successful without them. Then we get the other fascinating secondary effect in Buenos Aires is the evolution of 19th century eschatology, thinking about the end times, thinking about the return of Jesus and the Messiah, thinking about what this means for independence. And what Burukua shows us is how this is also woven into the story of the Buenos Aires struggle, coming really from, to my mind, out of a very unusual location, coming from this Chilean Jesuit author, published in London, with General Belgrano playing this role, seeking for some monarch to rule Rio de la Plata. It really kind of amazing. But you see again the interacting forces as soon as the implantation takes place. Donc dans le cas de Buenos Aires, il y a un enjeu entre les mouvements de libéralisation des esclaves, le rôle des anciens esclaves qui sont devenus des hommes libres ou demi-libres pour une période, et aussi l'importation dans le contexte de Buenos Aires qui cherche une indépendance de l'Espagne, l'importation des théories de l'eschatologie de fin du monde, théorie catholique, qui anime le mouvement pour l'indépendance de l'Espagne à l'heure actuelle. Parce qu'à l'heure actuelle, on peut réaliser le paradis sur Terre, on peut dire. Plus ou moins. Pas encore, mais bon, ça va. Finally, And to me, most crucially, and this is because I am a politologue, so I'm sorry that I'm bringing my peculiarity to this question. What it feels like to live in these contexts and what people do, what kind of agency and creativity they engage in is really the payoff for all of these studies. The first two elements, the mise en scène and the sort of way that structures are becoming fluid, is wonderful, but the real payoff is looking at this agency. And it is, in a way, what Jody Benjamin refers to as the creation of emergent cosmopolitanisms. Very plural, very translocal, and critically, in all the papers, transtemporal, for us to realize that cosmopolitanism as a concept, as a social experience, has deep, deep history and a complex set of localities. That is, in effect, what it means to live the global within the local, is to create one's own cosmopolitanism, which in some ways all of these papers point to. I won't translate that. I'll go ahead. For Teixeira, one of the most interesting pieces, which I look forward to seeing more of the book, is the tantalizing hint that space itself is an actor in the creation of an emergent cosmopolitanism in Natal and Dakar. The hint is the comparative role of plateaus, high ground, and the way that you describe the fact that the first settlement in these plateaus affects the tissue of the entire city. I don't know Natal at all, but I know Dakar. And having lived in Dakar, I sort of imagine what this might look like, but I'd much rather hear you say it, is that the plateau as place of first settlement has a nice geometric grid to it. The role of greenery is very clear, the role of trees. The Haussmann scale, verticality of the buildings is very clear. And then if you go out of Dakar a bit to the northwest up the peninsula, to Medina, to Gedjouai, elsewhere to Pekin eventually, you get a much more organic, kind of, one could say chaotic, or one could say really lived experience. And of course, this is highly racialized in early Dakar. And it maps onto the distinction between citoyen and sujet, which was a central theme in the colonization of Senegal. So I'm sure this is where this goes. And so in a mode that sounds like actor network theory of Bruno Latour, I'm not sure if this is the intent, the physical space itself is part of the story, is an actor in determining the enjeu and the way that one lives the experience of the local in the global. And for Natal, maybe it's a similar story. Donc à Dakar, c'est l'espace lui-même qui joue un rôle parce que l'implantation de ville au plateau, c'était une implantation qui a créé un certain espace urbain d'un certain style européen. Et les bords du plateau, il y a un autre environnement urbain qui est très différent. Et donc c'est le rôle de l'espace lui-même qui peut-être détermine un peu l'expérience de vivre dans un tel contexte. For Benjamin, this question of the lived experience within these complex interactions, these overlapping waves, is absolutely the heart of the paper. It's the best part of the paper. He has a very meticulous use of everyday social relations, of fashion, of sexuality, to show this negotiation. Just some examples that really struck me. The Lapteau move in his work very clearly from mechanistic interpreters to active agents of reshaping not only their own identity, but their roles in the new economy. The signare, who are positioned in places of complex gender power, identity mutability, and translation here in San Luis and also in Bordeaux. Just a great example from the paper, control access to sex, control access to young women, and then control the offspring of these young women. And so they are, it's a great example of how the study of sexuality really enriches this kind of work and it goes way beyond what kind of prudish Protestant historiography would have avoided, really, would have said in the ellipses. So it shows us another form of power, commerce, and agency within the context of these rapidly transforming structures of identity, of social relations, and economy. Then the great example of the signore loans to a village chief who doesn't have much cloth, loans him a bunch of paña, a bunch of cloth to wear so he can go to take a market day and look like a big man, because otherwise he looks like nobody. And then I think he gives it away in a clientelistic fashion to some of his family, some of his relations. But that's very new kind of economic relation that these powerful women who control all kinds of useful resources in urban space are now creating beneficiaries and clients in rural space through the mediating use of what? Cloth, of something so incredibly everyday, which is really the best part of this work, and what makes the coming book so exciting is the use of textiles and cloth as a lens to get at, I think, all of the questions that the panel is asked to look at: the local global interactions, the way structures themselves are deforming, and the role of human agency in that context. So really exciting way to think about human operations within entanglement. Très rapidement, parce que je sais que j'ai mangé beaucoup de temps. Dans l'intervention de Benjamin, on a, c'est la meilleure partie de son papier, c'est l'étude de ces opérations, disons, individuelles pour négocier l'espace mutable des nouvelles structures d'identité et de pouvoir. Par exemple, le rôle des laptos qui commencent comme simples intermédiaires mécaniques et qui deviennent finalement des acteurs qui transforment leur identité, leur rôle économique et les relations économiques autour d'eux. En même temps, l'exemple des signare qui contrôlent l'accès aux jeunes filles sexuelles et qui l'échangent pour certaines autres ressources. Et donc, c'est un exemple du rôle mutable, transformant des signaux au point d'intersection entre des sociétés et des économies multiples. Et même un excellent exemple, c'est l'exemple de signare qui donne un prêt, qui prête des pagnes à un chef villageois qui n'a rien du tout. Comme quoi le chef villageois peut arriver au marché journalier ou hebdomadaire comme quelqu'un, comme un boss, comme un grand homme. Mais c'est à la dépendance d'une signare qu'il a prêté le tissu. Et c'est le tissu même qui montre le tissage quotidien des nouvelles relations. C'est le tissu comme fenêtre pour voir toutes ces transformations qui fait le tableau très intéressant. And again, in Burukua, in Buenos Aires, I see similar indications if one reads the paper from the point of view of the urgency of making independence from Spain successful, of getting the job of overthrowing Spain done. Then what we have is a really fascinating way that some local actors, it's not exactly clear who, and some freed slaves find their way towards using emancipation as a military tool. Then you mentioned briefly this really interesting question of of the terms in which someone can marry across racial lines. And the key point, as I read the paper, is that in the past, before this period of rapid push towards independence, families tried to prevent interracial marriage to protect the honor of the young girl, to protect the bloodline of the family. If the young girl was white and the proposed husband was of African descent, then the goal was to protect her honor, but this shifts in the record. And later it is families protecting the young men who are white from marriage to young women who are of African descent, so as to protect the lines of inheritance of family wealth. So we switch from honor to wealth. We switch from a pre-capitalist to a capitalist motivation for managing marriage, which is used as an indication of the increasingly bourgeois notion of including bourgeois identity and social formations of Buenos Aires, which pushes us towards independence. And then, even more amazing, is this deployment of the end of the world, arrival of Jesus, and the creation of a better world as a movement towards independence, which, without being fascinating enough, involves at the last minute, for a few months, the idea that we should restore the Inca emperor as the monarch of Rio de la Plata. It's really like science fiction, actually, in some ways. But the point is, whether it's Belgrano, whether it's the families trying to defend their young men, whether it's the libertos, everyone is finding some way to navigate in this space, and we're seeing the same kind of creative agency that the other papers also suggest, and which I think is critical to our understanding of how anyone lives the global within the local through these everyday operations. Donc, peut-être je dois m'arrêter là-bas. J'ai quelques autres points pour les autres que je vais les donner. Very good paper.
Thank you very much, Denis, for understanding of what we have heard this morning. And I do agree on one point, the main issue, I think, is that we have to do with how people live in the ordinary life, the link between local and global. So thank you very much. We have not much time, officially 5 minutes, but if you agree, we can reduce the coffee break, or if you want, we may already go to have a coffee, but how many questions? I don't know exactly, not too many, 3 or 4, and you can ask your questions afterwards during the coffee break, perhaps. So, we take the questions. Who want? In French or in English, of course, it doesn't matter.
C'est une contribution, hein? C'est pas une question.
No. Yeah, oui, mais pas trop long.
Non, non, non. Non, non, c'est... On me reproche d'être long. C'est pas...
Short contribution.
J'ai pris
We have
4
no time for another presentation.
J'ai pris 4 points, mais je n'en dirai qu'un. Donc, on va pas abuser du temps. Voilà, donc, merci beaucoup. Merci, chers exposants. Et j'ai une petite contribution, c'est la similitude. Hein, que je vois, je suis un géographe de formation, un apprenti géographe. Alors, c'est la similitude que je vois entre le nord-est brésilien et la savane sénégalaise. Et ensuite, si on continue un peu, on a l'impression, quand on s'initie à la carte du monde, le planisphère, on a l'impression que la tête de l'Afrique s'insère harmonieusement dans le ventre de l'Amérique, le Sud, et vice-versa aussi. Comme si c'était une volonté de revenir au Gondwana. Alors, ensuite, il y a un autre élément, c'est que le même relief, la même végétation qui existe au nord-est existe au Sénégal. Si bien que je suis un peu dans l'élevage, que les vaches Nelore, Cougera, etc., qu'on importe du Brésil, s'adaptent très simplement ici dans la savane sénégalaise. Il en est de même pour les herbes, les cultures fourragères, le maralpha, etc. et tout, donc ça vient un peu, etc. Donc ces éléments-là, il faut aller jusqu'au bout et ensuite voir que nous sommes vraiment les mêmes et que la nature nous rapproche et que nous devons essayer de voir un peu toute cette géostratégie dont je parle, etc. et tous ces éléments. Merci.
I suppose you don't need a translation, or no, it's okay? You prefer to have a translation?
Okay. I have 4 points, but I'll only say one because we don't have time. The contribution is the resemblance between the two different localities. I am a geographer, and when I look at the map of the world, you can see how northeastern Brazil and Senegalese savanna look alike. A second look, you would also see how the head of Africa fits in the belly of America, and vice versa. So we have the same vegetation here and there. Carl from Brazil coped very well here in Senegal. herbs as well. So it must be nature teaching us that we pretty much the same.
Thank you. Another question over there.
Thank you very much for your papers. This question is inspired a little bit by Jody's paper, and I think it relates to all the papers, and that is, for the theme of the panel, how do you manage, what are the strategies that you use to go back and forth between the big picture and the sort of zoomed in specificity, right? So how do you, like when you're constructing a larger text or a book, do you go, because you're making a larger philosophical argument about rethinking how we talk about or center the transatlantic slave trade in narratives of 18th and 19th century West Africa versus looking at African attitudes, ideas, and dreams of what lives are about. So do you go back and forth in each chapter, or do you go across sections, right, as you go from out to in order to help the reader follow you, because it's so much, right, going on at once?
Well, I prefer you answer.
So that is a problem that I basically am thinking through as I go. But I think my initial response would be that there needs to be a little bit of both in each chapter, essentially. Because, as I said, while the local and the individual, which are very fragmentary in terms of being able to actually even pull that out, that isn't sufficient, I don't think, in terms of helping to explain the broader picture. And so, I mean, I basically have the benefit of all of this other work, right, that I can use and frame around these sort of more periodically sort of deep investigations of local interactions. And I hope by doing that to, you know, just kind of provide more insight into the local. Sort of, so basically, I sort of go back and forth. But I'm making it up as I go. I wish I could say that, you know, I had some grand sort of theory about that.
I'd like to make a comment about the question, because when I refer to my book, it's divided into two parts. One is the territorial, the global, all this discussion, and the second part, I go into the space and the society of the cities. And your comment about the plateau in high city, I'd love to talk about that at the time also. Sure, Natal is also a plateau, it's kind of a plateau, and some parallels can be made between the two.
Short question, please.
Okay. One short question. So I have a question to ask Professor Benjamin. First, thank you, Professor, for your presentation. In the presentation, you highlight the African participation in the world trade. My question is about during the conflict between French and Britain to seek the control of the St. Louis, which kind of role the local authority plays? Why does the local authority were involved in the conflict between British and French, or is this the local authority just as an outsider, or they play a very important role in the conflict?
Thank you for the question. My understanding is that in the case of Cayor, the Darnell basically wanted to stay out of conflicts between Britain and France. So that's one answer. But the other sort of element to consider is that part of the sort of French return to Saint Louis was really facilitated by a kind of longer, earlier presence here and the sort of emergence of a local elite in that earlier context. And so there's a sense in which during the period when the British were here, that this local, already French-identified, Catholic-identified elite essentially saw an opportunity to return to an earlier sort of relationship with the French. So in that sense, they were interested, right, in sort of siding or sort of facilitating the French return. But in terms of the sort of roll-off kingdom policy towards that they were basically staying out of it. So that would be our response. Thank you.
José Emilio, José Emilio.
Je voulais répondre à la question de Laurel par rapport à la méthode. Donc, il faut dire que c'est plutôt commencer par les sujets tels quels. Ils sont devenus, qui ont eu un sens en commun après. Hein? Donc, c'est un peu parce que ça a évolué dans le temps. J'ai commencé avec l'étude de l'esclavage dans les années 90. Et puis, j'ai trouvé ce livre où l'on parle, par exemple, de la présence des Africains à Buenos Aires et en Amérique du Sud comme un des signaux qui assurent cette arrivée, deuxième arrivée de Jésus-Christ. Parce que c'était une condition préalable, la communication, l'intercommunication de toute l'humanité pour que ça puisse arriver. Donc c'est des petits sujets qu'à un moment donné, je me suis rendu compte que tous confluaient dans une explication plus générale. Et donc la présence africaine était un peu la clé.
La toute dernière, c'est qu'il y a une constante pour Natal comme pour Dakar, c'est l'arrivée des caravelles. Au moment où certains les politologues, la rente géostratégique transsaharienne s'est tarie au profit de la rente géostratégique transatlantique. Il faudra interpeller le blocus qu'il y a eu au niveau de la Méditerranée avec la côte italienne, ce qui a entraîné cette connexion entre maintenant Dakar, qui, comme Natal, était au niveau des périphéries. Parce que si vous prenez le centre du Yolof, si vous prenez le centre du Cayor, si vous prenez le centre du Sine, si vous prenez le centre du Saloum, si vous prenez le centre du Ndiambou, si vous prenez le centre du Waalo, Dakar était une périphérie. Mais avec l'arrivée de ces caravelles qui ont supplanté les caravanes, Dakar a eu à émerger. Et il y a eu cette interconnexion. Il y a eu un mouvement centrifuge, il y a eu un mouvement centripète. Je voudrais interpeller Benjamin. Votre tranche chronologique, c'est sur 32 ans, 1875, 1785, 1817. Vous ferez mieux d'élargir la tranche chronologique pour voir véritablement l'influence de l'islam depuis pratiquement les Almoravides jusqu'au mouvement de réforme islamique de Nasr el-Din jusqu'à Cheikh Omar Foutiyou Tall pour véritablement séduire cette transformation. Merci beaucoup.
So thank you, all of you, for your presentations and your understanding of what was said. It was a very fruitful session, and now enjoy your coffee break. Thank you very much.